from the very early Middle Ages to the very late Middle Ages. Well, not extremely much. Let's say across, the 14th and 15th century today. And it's gonna be a brief video actually because it's not really a big thing, but just an observation about the age of the Condottieri. Now, for everyone who knows a bit from late medieval European military history, indeed the figure of the Condottieri is very well known. We're talking about military men, professional soldiers that were hired under contract that was called the condotta, as a matter of fact, hence the name of the condottieri. That means, the guys were under the condotta, and that fought at the service especially of Italian regional states, or other smaller powers in Italy, and they're mostly famous because of the debate that one day I hope to cover about their effectiveness, especially in the face of the different political and military organization that they represented in Italy, in a moment in which other countries that were being unified under a single monarchy, such as France or Spain, were instead creating mm, um, sort of permanent armies that depended from the king and weren't made up of mercenaries, but of, let's say, national troops, or at least troops that that weren't paid for a short time, um, and hired just in case of necessity, like it had happened in Italy, at least up to a certain point. And this is excuse me, what I really want to talk about today. The idea that the condottieri weren't just adventurers or people who you know um, made often a living throughout all their existence as military men, but that somehow switched from one employer to another. We're talking about the same Italian lords um, working essentially as condottieri, and you know performing this profession in a broader political um, um, meaning, rather than just a short military performance. And I want to talk especially about the case of Gian Francesco Gonzaga. Um, why about this specific noble of northern Italy? Well, because he was one of among at least one of the first Italian lords to exercise the activity of condottiere or condottiero, as being, as a matter of fact, the lord of Mantua, or Mantova in Italian, as you want to call it. Actually, at the time in Italy, the name in the local tongue was Mantua. It's very important to understand why, a lord would become a condottiero on his own, um, for his own dominions. Well, the case of Mantua is really peculiar because Mantua was a smaller political entity in the Italian play, let's say, in the Italian game, um, which, however, had an excruciating strategic importance in the political asset, especially of northern Italy. Why? Because it was, the city of Mantua and its district were essentially between two main Italian powers and European powers, let's say at the time, that were Venice and Lombardy, Venice and Milan. These two powers were really great. Milan had expanded steadily, in spite of some minor setbacks throughout the whole 14th and 15th century under the dynasty of the Visconti and later of the Sforza, and they had become the major terrestrial power in northern Italy. The Visconti were about basically to unify, or better to conquest, the whole northern and central Italy at a point. They failed for reasons that we won't be talking now, but the important part is that they remained a very big power, and the first, let's say, most worried power that had to deal with the growth of the Visconti's power was Venice. Venice, up to a certain point in its history, had managed to remain essentially detached from the inland Italian affairs. The Venetians really didn't care anything about having territories inland. They had their own city, perfectly defended by the lagoons, and their main interest was to make money through their maritime empire. So, having just a lot of smaller possessions, ports, essentially scattered all over the eastern Mediterranean, which allowed them very high profits through trade without having to spend money to keep large parts of land. But when Milan began to expand, and began to expand east, so towards northeastern Italy where Venice is, the Venetians were basically obliged to expand inland in their own turn, which they did, and in an extremely efficient way. Also for not just for the conquest in itself, but also in the way they were able to manage their military forces. They were much more reliable because they were much more controlled by Venice than what used to happen in other Italian powers, and also because they had also very efficient administration that was performed in similar ways with very good control from Venice on these inland areas. And as a matter of fact, the Venetians were able to reach a very close distance from Milan itself in this expansion. Well, Mantua was, in this period, so coming back to the Gonzaga dynasty, Mantua was exactly in the middle of these two powers. It was on the Po River. It had access to other rivers that obviously were important communication roads, and its location had a very highly strategical influence. Also because if they had passed to the side of Milan, they would have managed um, to to be a sort of conus into the Venetian dominions, which would have been very dangerous for Venice herself. And when we talk about Gian Francesco Gonzaga, Lord of Mantua, not surprisingly, he was um, um, under, let's say, Venetian protection. If I'm not wrong, he had been raised, after he had become lord when he was still a minor, because his father had died in 1407. So basically, the Venetian Republic decided to adopt him, or at least to provide defense for their own for his own succession to which was already there. I mean, but at least for the time he was a minor, a protection with some military that went to Mantua and to protect him. Actually, both his father and his uncle, who was a Malatesta incidentally, so another powerful prince, had carried out Philo-Venetian politics that had paid off Mantua in this sense. And in the 20s of the 15th century, when Gianfrancesco had become um, an adult and a warrior himself, he was at the service of Venice as a condottiero, which means that an Italian prince, like he was, not just an everyday guy that wanted to make money for using arms um, professionally, but a lord, so someone who had a broader political interest and had to manage both political and military affairs, was at service of Venice as a condottiero. And this was obviously had um, a good consequence, because for him at least, excuse me, um, because he obtained not only political protection from Venice, but also money, which obviously was, the oil of the time, as in every time, as a matter of fact, but also territorial acquisitions. And that was a bit the main thing at the time, because the Italian states, especially in the 14th century, but even in the 15th, especially in the first half of the 15th century, were actually rationalizing the political map of Italy. Italy, 1 century before was all small cities, or at least, it was a very fragmented, um, uh, it had a very politically fragmented asset. And this time, instead, the main lords managed to enlarge their dominions and to make more compact, larger, and consistent territorial dominions. So the ultimate goal for these dynasties was um, to get a small piece of land in here and another piece of land in there, and building up stronger dominion. And another important element, however, of the Gonzaga under Gianfrancesco is that they became marquises of Mantua. Before they weren't, and they became marquis because they paid, essentially. Also, this is another important point. They paid 12,000 golden florins, which was not a few, but not even excessively much, to receive from the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund in 1433 the title of Marquis. Now, you have to understand that even Italian powers at these times were politically, um, let's say, independent, even if it's not a really proper definition, meaning, yeah, they were independent, meaning that they did whatever the hell they liked, but they still had, um, and they always had and maintained um, a tie, a bond with the Holy Roman Empire, because technically speaking, the whole central and northern Italy were, as Kingdom of Italy, part of the Holy Roman Empire. So, um, since Germany was not a monarchy, a national monarchy like France, for instance, or like what it was being formed in Spain, with at least two big entities like Aragon and Castilla, um, Germany couldn't really intervene at this time, especially at the beginning of the 15th century, into Italy. Yeah, sometimes they did, but it wasn't like in the century before, when, especially in the first part, the Roman emperors, like in the previous centuries, went for their expedition in Italy and made big things. There is a sort of distance relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, um, which is still very important in the balance of powers in this time. So for Sigismund, who took Mantuan money, it was still important to confer, through his imperial authority, the title of Marquis of the Holy Roman Empire to Gian Francesco Gonzaga. Also because we're talking about an area that is roughly northeastern Italy, that was one that had historically more, had had a closer relationship with Germany. It was the area. Mantua is not very far from the Kingdom of Germany proper. Even Venice and Friuli are substantially very close to the Habsburg dominions at this time, um, and um, and therefore, however, these Italian powers had a good a good gain at obtaining an imperial title, title of nobility officially recognized by the Holy Roman Emperor. At a certain point, however, Gian Francesco's allegiance um, to Venice stopped, and he passed under Filippo Maria Visconti, so under the Milanese. And for this reason, he also lost certain possessions that he had gained. Um, so we see that he actually became general captain of the Visconti's army, as well as general captain of the Venetian army. And we don't have the time to discuss in detail why all this happened, but it's important at this point to understand how the policy of an Italian state could be done with a lord, so the chief of this dominion, passing from one side to another, to keep actually his dominions safe, because this is also one of the things. It's not the switch inside is an Italian thing by nature. It's that these powers were actually at a certain point obliged to behave in a certain way, because the whole political, not just the whole political situation in Italy, but also in Europe changed constantly, and it's extremely complicated to talk about this part in history in detail, because in order just to explain a side change, you would have to make a deep and huge research on its own to fully understand the whole implications and the whole reasons for these decisions. Um, and you have to think that the Gonzaga were. This is also nice to know because it's a dynasty that you don't often hear. You know, when you think about the Italian powers of the 15th century, broadly speaking, you know of Milan, Venice, the Pope, Florence, then the Kingdom of Naples, and Genoa, of course, but you know, in minor part. Instead, the Gonzaga were actually important. And they were also one of the last dynasties arrived. Like the Visconti were out there in China, you know, even if with some trouble at the command of Milan already from the late 13th century. Other dynasties actually were quite ancient and survived for a very long time, even if maybe by the 15th century they were minor powers, maybe actually fighting as condottieri. Think about the Montefeltro in the Papal States, for instance. Those were a very ancient and noble lineage. The Gonzaga actually came later compared to these, and more specifically in 1327, when they were actually put into place um, in Mantua with a coup orchestrated by the great Can Grande della Scala, who was Lord of Verona at the time, and that basically kicked away from Mantua the Bonacolsi family, which was the family at the time ruling in the city. Remembering that first half of the 14th century was actually a very turbulent time in Italy, much more than the 15th century, in which Gian Francesco Gonzaga lived. And however, this the time, let's say, relatively small family, had managed to maintain the Mantuan lordship throughout all these perils and in great rivalries which were also internal. Um, um, Before I was talking about the necessities of Mantua to switch side to be safe, you know, from Milan and Venice, because Milan and Venice obviously looked at Mantua in a way that they wanted to take it from their side, but at the same time they wanted to conquer it and to occupy it and to get rid of them and make it a stronghold for their own power. So we're talking about, you know, these external factor, but you have to think that in the great struggles and wars that were fought in Italy at the time, it's still amazing that the Gonzaga maintained their lordship, even because of internal rivalries, because the Gonzaga weren't very solidal with each other in the family. It wasn't just the Gonzaga telling the truth. There was always a lot of competition in these Italian lordships. Essentially, and you know why this is the case, because this lordship didn't begin like, um, um, I don't know, some noble lineages who came back from, I don't know, feudality or even royalty, that had a very strict defined line that told you who had to succeed. Initially, these families that eventually came to become these sort of princely like dynasties of Europe at the 15th century had actually begun from say relatively normal families, you know, people who were quite rich at the time, but that had actually not a great difference from the rest of the population, and that were quite enlarged family. And when you have an enlarged family, so essentially a clan, it's more difficult to impose, a direct succession lineage, and making power passing from person to person. So not only because obviously the heritage, the fortune of of the Lord is split between the brothers, and in fact the Gonzaga had, especially, and this instead was a peculiar trait of theirs. They had they used to assign big fiefs to the second born, to the, I don't know how to say that, the cadetti, cadet sons, the ones who weren't the first, um, the firstborn, and the main heir. So if you give a lot of of big dominions to these guys, well, it's not exactly the recipe for a very stable political asset. And however, yet Mantua went on. They managed to keep things together in spite of bitter rivalries, in spite of intersign wars, and switching side from Milan to Venice and vice versa. And also, this is also important, counting on the basically untakeable position that Mantua had. Mantua is really an impregnable place, considering that there's a river and a very substantial fortress that the Gonzaga had made build there. And if you have time, just check out Gonzaga's history, because it's quite interesting. And it's quite interesting, in fact, how they became traditionally, in beginning exactly from Gian Francesco Gonzaga, about whom we talked before. They became used, as well as other Italian lords, to make the profession of the Condottiere um, the one of the family, so that the Gonzaga would become renowned for their military prowess, at least up to a certain point. But let's say that for generations their first attitude was the profession of arms, and this indeed saved their their dominions for their own good. So the video actually came to be long as the others, even more. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any question about the Gonzaga, about the Condottieri period, just ask. At the moment I don't have many views, but I see that someone does watch the videos. So if we want to start with questions, I would be happy to answer them, and we can make this channel started and being quite entertaining, hoping that it is a little bit, at least, um, a bit entertaining um, already now. So thanks for listening.